A mere nervous affection, he immediately added, which would undoubtedly soon pass. It displayed itself in a host of unnatural sensations. Some of these, as he detailed them, interested and bewildered me, although perhaps the terms and general manner of the narration had their weight. He suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses. The most insipid food was alone endurable. He could wear only garments of a certain texture. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light, and there were but peculiar sounds, and these from stringed instruments, which did not inspire him with horror. To the anomalous species of terror I found him a bounden slave. "I shall perish," said he. "I must perish in this deplorable folly. Thus and not otherwise shall I be lost. I dread the events of the future, not in themselves, but in their results. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident, which may operate upon this intolerable agitation of the soul. I have indeed no abhorrence of danger, except in the absolute effect and terror. In this unnerved and in this pitiable condition, I feel that the period will sooner or later arrive when I must abandon life and reason altogether, in some struggle with the grim phantasm, fear. I learned, moreover, at intervals, that through broken and equivocal hints, another singular feature of his mental condition, he was enchained by certain superstitious impressions in regard to the dwelling which he tenanted, in whence for many years he had never ventured forth, in regard to an influence whose supposititious force was conveyed in terms too shadowy here to be restated. An influence which some peculiarities of the mere form and substance of his family mansion had, by dint of long sufferance, he said, obtained over his spirit, an effect which the physique of the grey walls and turrets of the dim tarn into which they all looked down had at length brought upon the morale of his existence. He admitted, however, although with hesitation, that much of the peculiar gloom which thus afflicted him could be traced to a more natural and far more palpable origin, to the severe and long-continued illness, indeed to the evidently approaching dissolution of a tenderly beloved sister, his sole companion for long years, his last and only relative on earth. Her decease, he said, with a bitterness which I can never forget, would leave him the hopeless and the frail, the last of the ancient race of Ushers. While he spoke, the Lady Madeline, for so she was called, passed slowly through a remote portion of the apartment, and without having noticed my presence, disappeared. I regarded her with an utter astonishment, not unmingled with dread, and yet I found it impossible to account for such feelings. A sensation of stupor oppressed me as my eyes followed her retreating steps. When a door at length closed upon her, my glance sought instinctively and eagerly the countenance of the brother, but he had buried his face in his hands, and I could only perceive that a far more than ordinary wanness had overspread the emaciated fingers through which trickled many passionate tears. The disease of the Lady Madeline had long baffled the skill of her physicians. A settled apathy, a gradual wasting away of the person, a frequent though transient affections of the partially cataleptical character, were the unusual diagnosis. Hitherto she had steadily borne up against the pressure of her malady, and had not betaken herself finally to bed, but on the closing in of the evening of my arrival at the house, she succumbed, as her brother told me at night with inexpressible agitation, to the prostrate power of the destroyer. And I learned that the glimpse I had obtained of her person would thus probably be the last I should obtain, that the lady, at least while living, would be seen by me no more. For several days ensuing, her name was unmentioned by either Usher or myself, and during this period I was busied in earnest endeavors to alleviate the melancholy of my friend. We painted and read together, or I listened, as if in a dream, to the wild improvisations of his speaking guitar, and thus, as a closer and still closer intimacy admitted me more unreservedly into the recesses of his spirit, the more bitterly did I perceive the futility of all attempt at cheering a mind from which darkness, as if an inherent positive quality, poured forth upon all objects of the moral and physical universe in one unceasing radiation of gloom. I shall ever bear about me a memory of the many solemn hours I spent alone with the master of the house of Usher. Yet I should fail in any attempt to convey an idea of the exact character of the studies, or of the occupations in which he involved me or led me the way. An excited and highly distempered ideality threw a sulphurous luster over all. His long improvised dirges will ring forever in my ears. Among other things I hold painfully in mind a certain singular perversion and amplification of the wild air of the last waltz of von Weber, from the paintings over which his elaborate fancy brooded, and which grew, touch by touch, into vagueness, at which I shuddered the more thrillingly, because I shuddered knowing not why. From these paintings, vivid as their images are now before me, I would in vain endeavor to adduce more than a small portion which should lie within the compasses of merely written words. By the utter simplicity, by the nakedness of his designs, he arrested an overawed attention. If ever mortal painted an idea, that mortal was Roderick Usher. For me, at least, in the circumstances then surrounding me, there arose out of the pure abstractions of which the hypochondriac contrived to throw upon his canvas an intensity of intolerable awe, no shadow of which felt I ever yet in the contemplation of the certainly glowing yet too concrete reveries of Fuseli. One of the phantasmagoric conceptions of my friend, partaking not so rigidly of the spirits of abstraction, may be shadowed forth, although feebly, in words. A small picture presented the interior of an immensely long and rectangular vault or tunnel, of low walls, smooth white, without interruption or device. Certain accessory points of the design served well to convey the idea that this excavation lay at an exceeding depth below the surface of the earth. No outlet was observed in any portion of its vast extent, and no torch or other artificial source of light was discernible. Yet a flood of intense rays rolled throughout, and bathed the whole in a ghastly and inappropriate splendor. I have just spoken of that morbid condition of the auditory nerve which rendered all music intolerable to the sufferer, with the exception of certain effects of stringed instruments. It was perhaps the narrow limits to which he thus confined himself upon the guitar, which gave birth in great measure to the fantastic character of his performances. But the fervid facility of his impromptu could not be so accounted for. They must have been, and were, in the notes as well as in the words of his wild fantasies, for he was unfrequently accompanied himself with rhymed verbal improvisations, the results of that intense mental collectedness and concentration to which I have previously alluded as observable only in particular moments of the highest artificial excitement. The words of these rhapsodies I have easily remembered. I was perhaps the more forcibly impressed with it, as he gave it, because in the under or mystic current of its meaning, I fancy that I perceived for the first time a full consciousness on the part of Usher, of the tottering of his lofty reason upon her throne. The verses which were entitled The Haunted Palace ran very nearly, if not accurately, thus. In the greenest of our valleys, by good angels tenanted, once a fair and stately palace, radiant palace, reared its head. In the monarch thought's dominion it stood there, never seraph spread a pinion over fabric half so fair. Banners yellow, glorious, golden, on its roof did float and flow. All this was in the olden time, long ago. And every gentle air that dallied in that sweet day, along the ramparts, plumed and pallid, a winged odor went away. Wanders in that happy valley, through two luminous windows saw, spirits moving musically, to a lute's well-tuned law. Round about that throne we're sitting, poor Phyrogene, in a state his glory well befitting, the ruler of the realm was seen, and all with pearl and ruby glowing was the fair palace door, through which came flowing, 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 and sparkling evermore, a troop of echoes, whose sweet duty was but to sing, in voices of surpassing beauty, the wit and wisdom of their king. But evil things in robes of sorrow assailed the monarch's high estate. Ah, let us mourn, for never morrow shall dawn upon him desolate. And round about his home the glory that blushed and bloomed is but a dim remembered story of the old time entombed. And travelers now within that valley through the red-litten windows see vast forms that move fantastically to a discordant melody, while like a rapid ghastly river through the pale door a hideous throng rush out forever and laugh, but smile no more. I well remember that suggestions arising from this ballad led us to a train of thought wherein there became manifest an opinion of Usher's, which I mention not so much on account of its novelty, for other men have thought this, as on account of the pertinacity with which he maintained it. This opinion in its general form was that of the sentience of all vegetable life, but in his disordered fancy the idea had assumed a more daring character, and trespassed, under certain conditions, upon the kingdom of inorganization. I lack the words to express the full extent or the earnest abandon of his persuasion. The belief, however, was connected, as I have previously hinted, with the grey stones of the home of his forefathers. The conditions of the sentience had been here, he imagined, fulfilled in the method of collocation of these stones, in the order of their arrangement, as well as in that of the many fungi which overspread them, and of the decayed trees which stood around, above all, in the long undisturbed endurance of this arrangement, and in its reduplication of the still waters of the Tarn. Its evidence, the evidence of the sentience, was to be seen, he said, and I here started as he spoke, in the gradual yet certain condensation of an atmosphere of their own about the waters and the walls. The result was discoverable, he added, in that silent yet importunate and terrible influence for centuries had molded the destinies of his family, and which made him what I now saw him, what he was. Such opinions need no comments, and I will make none. Our books, and books which for years had formed no small portion of the mental existence of the invalid, were, as might be supposed, in strict keeping with his character of phantasm. We pored together over such works as Ververt et Chartreuse of Grazet, Belphegor of Machiavelli, The Heaven and Hell of Swedenborg, The Subterranean Voyage of Nicholas Klim by Holberg, The Chiromancy of Robert Flood, of Jean d'Intergene, and of De la Cambre, The Journey into the Blue Distance of Tieck, and The City of the Sun of Campanella. One favorite volume was a small octavo edition of the Directorum Inquisitorum by the Dominican Emeric de Giron. Then there were passages in Pomponius Mela about the old African satyrs and Egipans, over which Usher would sit dreaming for hours. His chief delight, however, was found in the perusal of an exceedingly rare and curious book in quarto Gothic, the manual of a forgotten church, the Vigili Mortuorum Secundum Coram Ecclesiae Maguntine. It could not help thinking of the wild ritual of his work, and of this probable influence upon the hypochondriac.